The billionaire mocked his maid by asking for financial advice. Her first words left him speechless. Subscribe to the Maid's Secret for more stories. Don't risk missing the next story. Follow, comment, and share. Let's begin. The first thing you learn as a maid in a billionaire's mansion is how to breathe without sound. How to move through rooms as if you're made of nothing but air and intention. My footsteps had become whispers against the Italian marble floors of the Western Estate, a sprawling modernist palace overlooking the Pacific in Malibu. I'd been polishing the same glass table for 20 minutes, not because it needed it, but because Mr. Carter Weston was entertaining in the study, and leaving while he was mid-anecdote might draw attention. Drawing attention was the cardinal sin of service. So I told the board, "Gentlemen, if you can't see where this market is going, perhaps you should consider careers selling sunglasses." That laugh again. Deep, careless, expensive, the kind that fills an empty room and bounces off the walls like it owns them, which, in this house, it did. Carter Weston was 42 years old, with the confident posture of someone who had never worried about money and never would. His hair was dark, with distinguished touches of silver at the temples, and his eyes were the calculating blue of Pacific waters, deciding whether to nurture or drown you. Tonight, they sparked with the particular joy he derived from being the smartest person in a room of already intelligent people. 5 guests surrounded him, all in tailored evening wear that cost more than my yearly salary. They weren't friends. Men like Carter didn't have friends. They had strategic alliances, useful connections, and amusing diversions. Tonight's gathering fell into the third category. "Maria?" His voice cut through my thoughts. I froze, microfiber cloth still pressed against the gleaming glass. Carter never addressed the staff directly during gatherings. It violated the unspoken contract. We provide invisible perfection. They pretend we don't exist. I turned slowly, keeping my expression neutral. "Yes, Mr. Weston?" He was looking at me with that half-smile that never reached his eyes, the one that appeared on magazine covers with captions like "America's Most Ruthless Investor" and "The Man Who Can't Lose." His guests had all turned to look at me now, curiosity and amusement playing on their faces. "We were just discussing investment strategies," he said, swirling amber liquid in a crystal tumbler, "and I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to get a different perspective?" The pause before "different" carried weight, like the word itself was wearing expensive clothing it hadn't earned. I stood perfectly still, my hands clasped before me. 3 years of working in this house had taught me when a question was actually a trap. "Richard here believes in real estate," Carter continued, gesturing to a silver-haired man whose watch probably cost more than my childhood home. "Mackenzie is all about tech startups. But I wonder," he leaned forward, that smile widening, "what would you do, Maria, if you had, say, $1 billion to invest?" The room erupted in chuckles, not loud, nothing so uncouth as actual laughter, but the gentle ripple of amusement that comes when people share a joke at someone else's expense. In that moment, I saw myself as they must see me, the Filipino woman in the simple black uniform, the invisible hands that made their lives run smoothly. Someone who couldn't possibly understand the complex world of high finance and investment strategies. They didn't know about the economics degree hanging in my tiny apartment. They didn't know about the classroom in Queens, where I'd taught for 15 years before my husband Michael's cancer diagnosis. Before the medical bills started coming faster than our insurance could cover them. Before I took the only job that paid enough, fast enough to keep him alive. "I'd start by investing in something you can't lose," I said quietly, my voice steadier than I expected. "Respect." The subtle murmurs of amusement died instantly. Carter's smile faltered, the glass pausing halfway to his lips. "You think I need that?" he asked, still trying to maintain his smirk, but something had shifted in his eyes. I met his gaze directly, breaking another unwritten rule of service. Everyone who laughs at someone poorer than them does. For a heartbeat, the room was so silent. I could hear the ice settling in Carter's glass. The air felt charged, dangerous. I had just committed professional suicide, and we both knew it. Then from the corner of the room came the sound of slow, deliberate clapping. All heads turned to Eleanor Weston, Carter's mother, a woman of 70 who moved through the mansion like a ghost most days. She sat in a high-back chair near the fireplace, her silver hair swept into an immaculate chignon, her eyes, the same piercing blue as her son's, fixed on me with an expression I couldn't read. "Well said," she remarked, her voice carrying the refined accent of old Boston money. "Exceedingly well said." Carter looked between his mother and me, something complicated happening behind his eyes. The confident billionaire suddenly seemed uncertain, like a child caught misbehaving by the one person whose opinion actually mattered. "I think," Eleanor continued, rising with the grace of someone half her age, "that we might all benefit from remembering that wealth without character is just noise." She walked to the center of the room, her silk evening dress whispering against the floor. "Carter, darling, I believe Maria has other duties to attend to, doesn't she?" It wasn't a question. It was an elegant rescue. I nodded, grateful for the chance to escape. "Yes, Mrs. Weston, if you'll excuse me." As I slipped from the room, I could feel Carter's eyes following me. Not with anger, as I'd expected, but with something that looked almost like wonder. In the kitchen, I leaned against the counter and exhaled slowly. My hands trembled slightly as I filled a glass with water. 3 years of careful invisibility, shattered in 30 seconds of honesty. By morning, I'd likely be packing my things. That was quite something. I nearly dropped the glass. Carter stood in the doorway, his tall frame blocking the light from the hallway. How long had he been there? The kitchen was my sanctuary, the place where staff could exhale and be human again. He never came here. "Mr. Weston, I apologize if I—" He held up a hand, silencing me. "Don't." He stepped into the kitchen, looking strangely out of place among the industrial appliances and practical surfaces. "My father built his empire by crushing people like you," he said quietly, "and I thought that made him strong. But you—" He hesitated, something vulnerable flickering across his face. "You made me feel small, without saying a single cruel word." I didn't know how to respond. This wasn't in any handbook for household staff. Carter reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. "My mother did some research about you, about who you were before." He gestured vaguely at my uniform. My blood ran cold. How much did they know? He held out the envelope. "This isn't money, or not directly, it's something else." Cautiously, I took it from him. Inside was a letter on heavy cream stationery with the Weston Foundation letterhead. As I read, my vision blurred. It was an offer to fully fund the reopening of the community college economics program where I'd once taught, with me as its head. A scholarship fund in my name for underprivileged students. A full-time position with benefits that included comprehensive medical coverage. "Why?" I whispered, looking up at him. For the first time since I'd known him, Carter Weston's smile reached his eyes. "Because sometimes," he said softly, "even billionaires need to be schooled." Behind him, in the doorway, Eleanor Weston watched silently, a small, satisfied smile on her lips. And in that moment something shifted in the mansion's carefully ordered hierarchy. The woman no one noticed had become impossible to ignore, but as the weight of the envelope settled in my hands, I couldn't help wondering, was this genuinely a moment of transformation, or just an expensive way to ease a wealthy man's conscience? And what would happen when the novelty of his newfound respect wore off? The answer, as it turned out, would change both our lives in ways neither of us could have predicted. The morning after my confrontation with Carter Weston dawned with a strange tension in the air. Sunlight streamed through the mansion's floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating dust particles that danced like tiny universes, visible only in the right light, much like truths long hidden. I moved through my morning routine mechanically, my mind replaying the previous night's events. The envelope sat on my nightstand in the small staff quarters, its contents still feeling more like fiction than reality. My fingers had traced the embossed Weston Foundation logo a dozen times, as if testing whether it might dissolve under scrutiny. "You look like you've seen a ghost," said Lucia, the other full-time maid, as I entered the kitchen. Her observant eyes narrowed. "Something happened last night." Lucia had worked for the Westons for 11 years, weathering the family's storms with quiet resilience. At 56, she wore her experience in the subtle lines around her eyes and in how efficiently she moved through spaces designed to make people like us invisible. "Mr. Weston and I had a conversation," I replied carefully. "About respect." Lucia nearly dropped the coffee mug she was filling. "Maria," she whispered, "you didn't." Before I could respond, the kitchen door swung open. Eleanor Weston stood there, impeccably dressed in a cream silk blouse and tailored trousers despite the early hour. Unlike her son, Eleanor's presence in the kitchen wasn't unusual. She believed in knowing every corner of her domain. "Good morning, Lucia." "Maria, a word?" She gestured toward the garden. The Weston Estate Gardens were a masterpiece of controlled wilderness, meticulously planned to appear perfectly untamed. We walked in silence along stone paths bordered by native California plants until we reached a secluded bench overlooking the ocean. "My son has always had a blind spot," Eleanor said without preamble. "He sees numbers, patterns, opportunities, but rarely people." She turned those perceptive blue eyes on me. "Until you made him look." I shifted uncomfortably. "Mrs. Weston, about last night. I've known about your background for some time, Maria." Her voice was matter-of-fact without judgment. "I make it my business to know who works in my home. Economics professor at Queen's Community College, published in several respected journals. Forced to leave when your husband's medical costs became untenable." My throat tightened. "Then why hire me as household staff?" A small, enigmatic smile played at her lips. "Sometimes people need to remember who they are by becoming something else entirely." She looked out toward the horizon. Carter inherited his father's business acumen, but also his worst traits: arrogance, detachment, a certain callousness toward those he considers beneath him. She turned back to me. "What my son offered you last night, the foundation position, it wasn't just for you. I don't understand." "Carter needs to learn that worth isn't measured by the size of one's portfolio." Her gaze intensified. "Take the position, Maria, but understand that your real job will be teaching my son something far more valuable than economics." Before I could respond, her attention shifted to something behind me. I turned to see Carter approaching, dressed in running clothes, a sheen of sweat glistening on his forehead. "Mother," he nodded, then looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Maria, I trust you've had time to consider my offer." Eleanor rose gracefully. "I'll leave you two to discuss business." She squeezed my shoulder lightly as she passed, a gesture so unexpected it left me momentarily speechless. Carter took his mother's place on the bench, maintaining a careful distance between us. Up close, without his usual armor of expensive suits and practiced smiles, he looked almost human, vulnerable. "Have you read through the details?" he asked. I nodded. "It's generous beyond anything I could have imagined. But," he caught the hesitation in my voice, "why the sudden interest in community college economics programs, Mr. Weston? You've built your reputation dismantling institutions, not funding them." Something flashed in his eyes, surprise perhaps at my directness, or maybe recognition that the invisible Maid had been paying attention to his business practices all along. "People can change," he said simply, "overnight. Because someone stood up to you at a party?" He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. 5 years ago, I acquired a manufacturing company in Michigan, streamlined operations, cut unnecessary expenses, textbook efficiency improvements. I knew what streamlined operations meant in the language of high finance: people losing jobs, families struggling, communities collapsing. 3 months later, the former owner committed suicide. His voice was flat, controlled. His note mentioned the 300 employees who lost their health care, people with conditions like your husband's. I couldn't hide my shock. This wasn't information you'd find in financial newspapers or glossy magazine profiles. I told myself it was business, not personal. Carter stared at his hands. "I've been telling myself that for 5 years." He looked up, meeting my eyes directly. "Your words last night, they sounded like his. In that note." The weight of his confession settled between us. For the first time, I saw beyond the billion-dollar facade to the human being underneath, flawed, complicated, and perhaps capable of growth. "The foundation position," he continued, "it's yours regardless of what you decide about continuing here. No strings attached." "And if I wanted to do both?" The question surprised even me. Carter's eyebrows rose. "Both? The foundation during the day, this job on weekends." I held his gaze steadily. "I still have medical bills to pay. And perhaps we both have things to learn from each other." A slow smile spread across his face, genuine this time, reaching all the way to those calculating blue eyes, warming them into something almost kind. "Maria Reyes," he said, extending his hand. "I believe this is the beginning of a very interesting partnership." As we shook hands, the morning sun cast our shadows long across the garden path, a billionaire and his maid, their silhouettes indistinguishable in the golden California light. What neither of us could see was Eleanor Weston watching from her balcony, a chess master observing the opening moves of a game she had quietly orchestrated. Nor could we anticipate how quickly this fragile new understanding would be tested by Carter's business rivals, by my past, and by secrets the Weston family had kept buried for generations. 2 months into my dual role as foundation director and weekend household staff, I developed a strange rhythm. Weekdays were spent in a sleek downtown office with my name on the door, Maria Reyes, executive director, reviewing scholarship applications and designing curricula. Weekends found me back in uniform, maintaining the careful invisibility of service at the Weston estate. The contradiction wasn't lost on anyone, least of all the other staff. "It's like watching someone live in 2 different dimensions," Lucia commented one Saturday morning as we prepared breakfast. "Doesn't it give you whiplash?" I smiled faintly, arranging fresh fruit on a silver tray. "Sometimes, but there's value in remembering both worlds." The truth was more complicated. Each role offered a different kind of power and a different kind of limitation. In the foundation office, I had authority, but remained conscious of whose money made it possible. In the Weston household, I had intimate access to the family's private world, but was expected to remain its silent observer. Or at least, that had been the arrangement until today. "Ms. Reyes." Carter's voice broke through my thoughts as he entered the kitchen, something he'd begun doing with increasing frequency. "I need your expertise this afternoon." I looked up, noting his unusually serious expression. "Foundation business, Mr. Weston?" "No, Billy." He glanced at Lucia, who immediately found something requiring her attention in the pantry. "Personal business, the kind that requires both your economics background and your unique perspective." 30 minutes later, I found myself in Carter's private study, a space I normally only entered to clean, sitting across from him at his desk while he slid a folder toward me. "What do you see?" he asked, as I reviewed the documents. I studied the financial statements carefully. A pattern of quiet acquisitions through shell companies. Someone's systematically buying up properties surrounding your new development in Brooklyn. "Exactly." Carter's jaw tightened. "Andrew Blackwood." The name hung in the air between us. Andrew Blackwood was Carter's former mentor turned bitter rival, a Wall Street legend known for destroying companies and rebuilding them in his own image. The financial media loved portraying their rivalry as a Shakespearean drama of betrayal and revenge. "He's trying to block your affordable housing component," I realized aloud. The Brooklyn project was the first Western development to include substantial low-income units, something I'd cautiously suggested during one of our increasingly frequent conversations. "Not just block it, leverage it." Carter stood, pacing the length of his study. "He's offering me a deal. He'll sell me the surrounding properties at a reasonable price if I drop the affordable housing." I set the folder down. "And if you refuse?" He'll develop luxury condos that make the affordable units worthless, blocking their light, creating parking nightmares, essentially ensuring that no one who actually needs affordable housing would want to live there. The brilliance of the trap was undeniable. Either Carter abandoned the project's social impact or risked its financial viability. "What will you do?" I asked quietly. He stopped pacing, fixing me with an intent look. "That's why you're here, Maria. What would you do?" The question wasn't rhetorical. In the weeks since our garden conversation, Carter had begun seeking my opinion with increasing frequency, first on foundation matters, then gradually on his business decisions. This, however, involved stakes far higher than anything he'd previously shared. "You're asking the former community college professor how to outmaneuver Andrew Blackwood." I couldn't keep the surprise from my voice. "I'm asking the woman who sees what men like me often miss." His expression was earnest, without a trace of his usual calculated charm. I considered the problem, thinking not just as an economist, but as someone who had lived on both sides of wealth's divide. "The conventional move would be to call his bluff or counter-purchase elsewhere," I said slowly. "But there's another approach. Make him a different offer." Carter raised an eyebrow. "What kind of offer?" "Partner with him." "Partner with Blackwood?" Carter looked at me as if I'd suggested setting his money on fire. "The man has been trying to destroy me for a decade." "Exactly. So change the game." I leaned forward. "Offer him something he hasn't considered. Genuine collaboration with community input. Real investment in neighborhood infrastructure beyond just buildings. The kind of project that would generate the positive press he needs after that insider trading scandal last year." Carter studied me with new intensity. "Turn his trap into an opportunity, and in the process, create something neither of you could build alone." He was silent for a long moment. Then unexpectedly he laughed, a genuine sound without the performative edge I'd grown accustomed to hearing. "Maria Reyes, you would have been a formidable Wall Street player." "I prefer teaching," I replied simply. "Yet here you are, strategizing in a billionaire's study." His tone was thoughtful rather than mocking. "Here I am," I agreed, "still wondering if you'll actually follow through." Our eyes met across the polished desk. A moment of perfect honesty between two people occupying vastly different worlds. The question hanging between us wasn't just about this deal, but about whether Carter's apparent transformation was genuine or merely an expensive form of absolution. The study door opened before he could respond. Eleanor Weston stood in the doorway, elegant as always in a tailored navy dress. Her eyes moved between us, registering our proximity, the open folder, the atmosphere of shared conspiracy. "I wasn't aware you had a meeting scheduled, Carter." Her voice was pleasant, but held a note of curiosity. "Impromptu strategy session, Mother." Carter closed the folder casually. "Maria has some insights on the Brooklyn situation." Eleanor's gaze settled on me. "I'm sure she does." Something in her expression made me wonder if this was precisely what she had anticipated when she'd encouraged me to take the foundation position. "Will you be joining us for dinner tonight, Maria?" "As a guest, not staff." The invitation caught me off guard. She will," Carter answered for me, ignoring my surprised look. "We have more to discuss." "Wonderful," Eleanor smiled. "Oh, and Carter," Richard Harlow called. "Something about the old properties in Queens?" He said it was urgent. I noticed a subtle tension in Carter's shoulders at the mention of Queens. Eleanor noticed it too, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I'll handle it," he said curtly. After Eleanor left, a strange silence filled the study. Carter seemed suddenly distant, his momentary openness replaced by something guarded. "Is everything all right?" I asked. "Fine." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Just another fire to put out. Nothing for you to worry about." But there was something in his evasion that unsettled me. After months of gradually increasing transparency, this sudden wall felt significant. "Queens," I said carefully. "That's where I taught, where my husband and I lived." Carter gathered the documents quickly. "Pure coincidence." Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to make some calls before dinner." The dismissal was clear. I rose to leave, stopping at the door. "Mr. Weston, Carter, whatever this is, it's business, Maria. Just business." His voice had returned to the cool, detached tone of the billionaire I'd first met. "I'll see you at dinner." As I closed the study door behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something important had shifted. In the hallway, I nearly collided with Lucia, who was walking past with an armload of linens. "Everything okay?" she asked, noting my expression. "I'm not sure," I admitted. Lucia glanced at the closed study door, then lowered her voice. "Be careful, Maria. The Westons have secrets that go back generations, and Queens, that's where it all started, before they became Westons." "What do you mean?" But Lucia just shook her head. "Ask Eleanor tonight. If anyone knows the whole story, it's her." She hesitated. "Just remember, in houses like this, even kindness usually comes with a price." As she walked away, I stood motionless in the hallway, caught between two worlds and suddenly unsure of my footing in either. Tonight's dinner would clearly offer more than just food for thought. What I couldn't yet know was that the Queen's connection wasn't coincidental at all, and that it would lead to revelations that would shatter both Carter's carefully constructed world and my own. The Westons dined in what they called the informal dining room, a space that could comfortably seat 12 beneath a crystal chandelier worth more than my annual salary. Tonight, only 3 places were set on the mahogany table: Eleanor at the head, Carter to her right, and me across from him. I changed from my uniform into the only appropriate outfit I'd brought to the estate, a simple black dress that felt woefully inadequate among the casual opulence surrounding me. As I entered, both Westons stood, a courtesy that still felt jarring from people who had employed me to clean their home. "Maria," Eleanor gestured to my seat with graceful authority. "How wonderful to have you join us properly." Properly. The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. Dinner proceeded with the orchestrated precision I'd witnessed countless times from the other side of service. Gerard, the house manager who normally supervised my work, now poured wine into my glass with practiced deference, his expression betraying only the slightest hint of discomfort at this reversal. "Maria has some fascinating ideas about the Brooklyn development," Carter said, after preliminaries were exhausted, his earlier guardedness apparently forgotten. "Does she?" Eleanor sipped her wine, studying me over the rim of her glass. "I'd be interested to hear them." For the next several minutes, I outlined my thoughts on partnering with Blackwood, while Carter occasionally interjected with elaborations. Eleanor listened intently, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "Collaboration over competition," she said when I finished. "How refreshingly contrary to the Western approach." Her tone made it unclear whether this was criticism or approval. Carter shifted in his seat. "Times change, Mother." "People rarely do," she countered smoothly, "though I've observed some intriguing developments recently." Her gaze moved meaningfully between Carter and me. "Maria has brought fresh perspective to the foundation," Carter said, defensive edge creeping into his voice, "and apparently to much more." Eleanor set down her fork. "Queens, for instance." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Carter's expression hardened into the mask I recognized from board meetings and press conferences. "We're not discussing Queens," he said flatly. "Aren't we?" Eleanor turned to me. "Did you know, Maria, that before the Westons were Westons, they were the Whitlows?" William Whitlow, Carter's great-grandfather, built the family's first fortune in Queens during the 1930s. "Mother." Carter's warning was sharp. Eleanor continued as if he hadn't spoken. "Real estate primarily, acquiring properties during the Depression from desperate owners at pennies on the dollar. Quite the empire builder." Her smile was brittle. Of course, William had a particular knack for identifying vulnerable sellers. "This isn't dinner conversation," Carter said through clenched teeth. "On the contrary, it seems perfectly relevant given your current investments." Eleanor's gaze was unflinching. "Tell me, does Maria know about the Reyes property?" And the name hit me like a physical blow. Reyes, my family name. "What about the Reyes property?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the sudden rushing in my ears. Carter's face had gone pale. "This isn't how I wanted." "The community college," Eleanor interrupted, "where you taught, Maria. The one that closed due to financial troubles after your departure." She took another sip of wine, her composure absolute. "Carter acquired it last year through one of his shell companies, along with the entire block where your former apartment building stands." The room tilted slightly. "My old neighborhood, you bought it?" Carter wouldn't meet my eyes. "It was a strategic acquisition before we ever met." "Strategic," I repeated numbly. "And you never thought to mention this during our conversations about reopening the economics program? When you created a foundation position for me, I was going to tell you once the development plans were finalized." "Development plans?" The words felt hollow. "You're demolishing it, aren't you?" His silence was answer enough. "How wonderfully circular," Eleanor observed. "Carter acquires your former workplace and home, renders you jobless and displaced, then magnanimously offers you employment cleaning his mansion and eventually running his foundation." Her cold smile returned. "A perfect Western transaction." "That's not what happened," Carter snapped. "I didn't know Maria when the acquisition was made." "Yet you kept it from her after you did know her," Eleanor pointed out. "After all your talk of change and perspective." I stood abruptly, napkin falling forgotten to the floor. "Excuse me." "Maria, wait." Carter reached for my arm, but I pulled away. "Was any of it real?" I asked quietly. "The foundation? The scholarship fund? Or was it all just elaborate guilt management?" Before he could answer, I left the dining room, no longer caring about propriety or consequences. In the hallway, I nearly collided with Lucia, who had clearly been listening from just outside the door. "My room," she whispered, taking my elbow and guiding me toward the staff quarters. Now, once inside her small but meticulously kept room, Lucia locked the door and pulled a weathered folder from beneath her mattress. "I've worked for the Westons for 11 years, she said, her voice low and urgent. 9 of those years I spent organizing Eleanor's personal archives. She knows I saw things I shouldn't have, but she trusts my discretion." Lucia handed me the folder. "Until tonight." Inside were photocopies of documents dating back to the 1930s. Property deeds, foreclosure notices, and newspaper clippings chronicling the rise of William Whitlow, who later changed his name to Weston. And there, on a list of acquired properties from 1938, was a familiar name, Reyes. "My grandfather," I whispered, recognizing the address. "He lost everything in the Depression." "Ah, William Whitlow had a system," Lucia explained. "He targeted immigrant families, offered predatory loans, then engineered foreclosures. The Reyes property was particularly valuable. Large corner lot, good potential for commercial development. I stared at the evidence of a decades-old injustice that had shaped my family's trajectory across generations. Carter knows this history. Eleanor made sure of it. It's part of what she calls the education of a Western heir, understanding the ruthlessness that built their fortune. My mind raced, connecting pieces of a puzzle I hadn't known existed. The Queen's properties Carter's developing now, they're the same ones his great-grandfather took from families like mine. Lucia nodded grimly. History repeating itself, except this time, a descendant of one of those families is sitting at his dinner table. Not coincidence. The realization settled like ice in my stomach. Eleanor orchestrated this, my hiring, the foundation position, everything. Eleanor plays the long game, Lucia confirmed, but her motives aren't always what they seem. A soft knock interrupted us. We froze, eyes locked in silent panic. Then Eleanor's voice came through the door. "Maria, a word, please." Lucia squeezed my hand. "Remember, in this house, everyone has an agenda, even me." With shaking hands, I returned the folder and opened the door. Eleanor stood alone in the hallway, her regal bearing unchanged despite the dinner table confrontation. "Walk with me," she said. It wasn't a request. She led me to a part of the mansion I'd never entered, a small, book-lined study far from the main rooms. Unlike Carter's modernist workspace, this room felt personal, filled with photographs and mementos rather than awards and deal trophies. "My private retreat," Eleanor explained, closing the door behind us. "The only room Carter doesn't enter without explicit invitation. Why show it to me? Because you need to understand what's really happening here." She gestured to a photograph on her desk, a younger Eleanor beside a stern-looking man. "My late husband, Edward Weston, Carter's father. I know who he was. You know the public version. Brilliant investor, ruthless businessman. What you don't know is that he was also an absolute moral vacuum, a man who measured his worth solely by what he could acquire and control." Her voice remained steady, but something raw flickered behind her composed exterior. "I spent 35 years married to a man who saw people as assets or liabilities, nothing in between, including you, especially me." Eleanor's smile was sad. "And our son." She moved to a small safe concealed behind a landscape painting, entering a combination with practiced ease. From it, she withdrew a slim leather journal. Edward kept meticulous records of his victories, his word for deals that destroyed others. He taught Carter to do the same. She handed me the journal. Page 47. I opened it with reluctance, finding the entry she indicated. There, in precise handwriting, was a detailed account of a community college acquisition in Queens, my community college, complete with projections for the luxury condos that would replace it. The final line read, "Negligible community resistance expected. Reyes family property acquisition complete." "He targeted my family specifically," I said, the words barely audible. "Not Carter," Eleanor clarified. "Edward. This was his project, his last major deal before his death. Carter inherited it, along with everything else, and continued it." "Yes." Eleanor reclaimed the journal, returning it to its hiding place. "Until he met you." "What do you mean?" "The development has been stalled for months, since shortly after you confronted him that night at the party." Eleanor turned to face me fully. "He's been quietly looking for alternatives, ways to restore the college without losing the investment." My head was spinning. Why didn't he tell me? Because Carter is his father's son, but also something Edward never was, capable of shame. Eleanor's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "He's trying to fix something broken without admitting he broke it. Or that his family has been breaking things for generations," I added bitterly. "Precisely." She moved to the window, looking out at the darkened gardens. "Which brings me to why I arranged for you to work here. You did hire me because of my family name. I hired you because I recognized the opportunity for something I've waited decades to see. A Western confronting the true cost of wealth built on others' misfortune." She turned back to me, her gaze direct and unflinching. "The question now is what you'll do with this knowledge." I didn't sleep that night. How could I? My past and present had collided in ways I couldn't have imagined, revealing that my employment at the Western estate and everything that followed had never been coincidence but calculation. By dawn, I'd made my decision. I found Carter in his home office at 6 a.m., still in yesterday's clothes, surrounded by documents and empty coffee cups. He looked up when I entered, dark circles beneath his eyes, suggesting his night had been as sleepless as mine. "Maria." He straightened, tension visible in every line of his body. "I've been trying to figure out how to explain." "I'm not here for explanations," I interrupted, placing my employee badge and Foundation ID card on his desk. "I'm resigning, effective immediately." Carter stared at the cards, then back at me. "Don't do this. Let me show you what I've been working on." More Foundation grants? Another scholarship program? The bitterness in my voice surprised even me. More ways to buy absolution without addressing the actual damage? No. He pushed a folder toward me. "Look." Against my better judgment, I opened it. Inside were detailed plans for the Queen's property, not for luxury condos, but for a comprehensive community development. The community college reinstated with expanded programs, affordable housing units, a medical center with provisions for subsidized care. "When did you create this?" I asked, suspicious. "The initial concept." 3 weeks after you started at the foundation." He ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "It's been through 12 revisions since then. The most recent was completed yesterday before dinner." I studied the plans more carefully, recognizing elements from conversations we'd had over recent months, ideas I'd mentioned almost in passing that had apparently taken root. Why keep this secret from me? Because it wasn't ready. Carter stood, moving to the window. "Because I wanted it to be perfect before I showed you. Because I was ashamed of what? The development or the deception? Both." He turned to face me. "And because I knew once you discovered the truth about my family, about what we did to yours, you'd never look at me the same way again." There it was, the naked vulnerability I'd glimpsed occasionally beneath his polished exterior. For the first time, I saw Carter Weston not as the arrogant billionaire or the reformed philanthropist, but simply as a man trapped between his inheritance and his awakening conscience. "Your mother told me about your father's journal, about how the Queen's project was his." Carter's jaw tightened, "And I continued it until I met you. Why should I believe this change of heart is genuine? Because I've done what no Weston has ever done." He reached for another folder on his desk. "This contains the legal documents transferring ownership of the original Reyes property back to your family, along with financial compensation adjusted for inflation and lost opportunity over 85 years. My hand trembled as I took the folder. "This doesn't erase what happened." "Nothing can," he acknowledged quietly. "But it's a start." I wanted to maintain my anger, to reject this gesture as too little, too late. But the economist in me recognized the significance of what he was offering, not just restitution for my family, but a framework for addressing historical injustices that went far beyond symbolic gestures. "The community development plan," I said finally. "How real is it? As real as you want it to be?" Carter's expression was earnest. "I'm prepared to commit the full resources necessary, but it needs someone who understands both the financial mechanics and the human impact." He hesitated. "It needs you, Maria, to clean up another Western mess, to help create something neither of us could build alone." The echo of my own words from our earlier conversation wasn't lost on me. Neither was the irony of our reversed positions. Now he was asking me to see a larger possibility beyond justified anger. "There's something else you should see," Carter said, leading me to his computer. He opened a video conference recording dated the previous week, a meeting with Andrew Blackwood I hadn't known about. On screen, Carter was presenting our collaborative approach for the Brooklyn project to a skeptical Blackwood, emphasizing community benefits alongside profit potential. As the conversation progressed, Blackwood's resistance visibly softened. "You actually did it," I murmured, watching the two rivals reach tentative agreement. "You changed the game. Because of what you taught me." Carter paused the video. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Maria. I'm asking for a chance to do better, to be better than the men who built this fortune." Before I could respond, the office door opened. Eleanor stood there, impeccably dressed despite the early hour, observing us with that inscrutable expression I'd come to both admire and fear. "I see you've made your pitch," she said to her son before turning to me. "And what have you decided, Maria?" "I haven't yet," I replied honestly. Eleanor nodded as if this was precisely the answer she expected. "Then perhaps this might factor into your considerations." She handed me an envelope. "My own contribution to this reckoning." Inside was a letter establishing a trust in my husband Michael's name, a permanent endowment for cancer treatment research at 3 major hospitals, with emphasis on accessibility for underserved communities. "Why?" I asked, struggling to maintain composure. "Because true change requires more than one generation's efforts," Eleanor replied simply. "And because I've watched my son become something his father never was, a man who understands the weight of his privilege and the responsibility it carries." She touched Carter's cheek briefly, a gesture of such unexpected tenderness that I felt like an intruder witnessing it. "I'll leave you two to finalize details." At the door, she paused. Whatever you decide, Maria, know that some debts can never be fully repaid, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try." After she left, silence filled the office. Carter and I stood at an inflection point between past and future, between justified distrust and cautious hope. "I won't be your employee," I said finally. "Not at the foundation, not here. If I do this, it will be as an equal partner with independent authority." "Done," Carter agreed without hesitation. "Complete transparency going forward. No more secrets, no more hidden agendas. Absolute transparency and formal recognition of historical injustices beyond my family. A comprehensive review of all Western holdings with restitution where applicable." This gave him pause, as it should have. What I was proposing would fundamentally challenge generations of Western business practices and potentially cost billions. "That would be unprecedented," he said carefully. "Exactly. Either we acknowledge that true change requires true accountability, or this is just another expensive performance of conscience." Carter considered this, the weight of dynasty and privilege visible in his expression. Then something shifted in his eyes, resolution replacing calculation. "Agreed," he said, "but I have one condition of my own." "Which is?" "That we begin by addressing the most immediate debt." He took a step closer. "The one I owe you for forcing me to see what I've spent a lifetime ignoring." There was nothing of the entitled billionaire in his gaze now, only a man asking for the chance to become something better than his inheritance had prepared him to be. "Partners," I said, extending my hand. "Partners," he agreed, taking it. Outside the window, the first full light of morning spread across the Pacific. In the mansion's kitchen, I knew Lucia would be preparing breakfast, wondering about the outcome of last night's revelations. In Queens, my former students continued their lives, unaware that the closed campus that had disrupted their education might soon reopen its doors. And here, in this sunlit office built on generations of ruthless acquisition, something new was taking root. Not forgiveness exactly, but possibility. The acknowledgement that while the past couldn't be undone, the future remained unwritten. "Where do we start?" Carter asked. I picked up the community development plans, feeling their weight in more ways than one. "With the truth," I said. "All of it, out in the open." Or what neither of us could anticipate was how quickly that truth would be tested, or how the public revelation of the Western legacy would ripple through financial markets, courtrooms, and living rooms across the country. The journey from performative charity to genuine accountability would prove far more complex than either of us imagined. But that morning, standing in the soft California light, one thing became clear. Sometimes the most valuable investment isn't the one that yields the greatest return, but the one that finally balances the books. 6 months after our agreement in Carter's sunlit office, I stood beside him on a makeshift stage in Queens, facing a crowd of community members, former students, and media representatives. Behind us stood the renovated community college building, its doors ready to reopen after years of darkness. "Today marks not just the revival of an educational institution," Carter was saying, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd, "but the beginning of a new approach to development, one that acknowledges historical injustices and prioritizes community restoration over profit maximization." Camera shutters clicked rapidly as he spoke. The story had become irresistible to the press. Billionaire heir confronts family's predatory past, partners with former maid whose family had been among the victims. Some outlets portrayed it as redemption, others called it a calculated PR move. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in the complex middle. I stepped to the microphone next, surveying the familiar faces of my former community, people whose lives had been disrupted by the college's closure, by rising rents, by the relentless mechanics of wealth concentration that had benefited the Westons for generations. When I first entered the Weston household as an employee, I couldn't have imagined standing here today, I began. But what's happening here isn't about me, or even about the Weston family. It's about recognizing that behind every financial transaction, every property acquisition, every development project, there are human lives affected, sometimes for generations. From the front row, my cousin Elena watched with cautious hope. The return of our grandfather's property, now housing a community health center named for my late husband, had initially been met with suspicion by my family. Blood money, Elena had called it. Maybe she was right, but I had come to believe that how the money flowed now mattered as much as how it had been acquired. The restitution initiative we're announcing today goes beyond this campus, I continued. It establishes an independent review board to examine historical Western acquisitions dating back to the 1930s, with the power to recommend appropriate remediation to affected families and communities. This announcement triggered a flurry of activity among the business reporters present. One shouted, "Is Western Enterprises prepared for the financial impact of such a broad restitution program?" Carter stepped forward again. Western Enterprises was built on certain practices that, while legal at the time, exploited vulnerable communities during periods of economic distress. The profits from those practices have compounded over decades. We can afford to address these historical imbalances. His corporate board had fought this initiative viciously. 3 directors had resigned in protest. Western stock had dropped 18% the day after our initial announcement, but Carter had stood firm, backed by Eleanor's unwavering support and, surprisingly, by several major institutional investors who recognized the long-term value of ethical realignment. After the ceremony, as we walked through the renovated campus buildings, Carter kept his voice low. "Andrew Blackwood called this morning." I raised an eyebrow. "And he's interested in adopting similar review processes for his historical holdings." A small smile played at Carter's lips. "Apparently, he doesn't want to be outmaneuvered on the ethics front." "Competitive conscience," I observed dryly. "Is it genuine? Does it matter if the outcome is the same?" I considered this as we entered what would soon be my office, not as foundation director, but as the newly appointed head of the economics department, a position I'd accepted alongside my role as independent overseer of the restitution initiative. "It matters," I said finally, "but it's a start." The space still smelled of fresh paint and new beginnings. Through the window, I could see students already exploring the campus, many of them recipients of the scholarship program we'd established. "Your mother didn't come today," I noted. "Eleanor prefers to work behind the scenes." Carter adjusted a picture frame on my desk, a photo of Michael from before his illness. "But she sent this." He handed me an envelope containing a single sheet of Western Foundation letterhead. On it was a brief note in Eleanor's elegant handwriting. "The true measure of wealth is what you give away. Congratulations on your first step toward genuine affluence." Beneath this cryptic message was a newspaper clipping from 1942, a small obituary for Thomas Reyes, my grandfather. The cause of death was listed as heart failure, but family law had always attributed it to despair after losing everything to William Whitlow's machinations. "Where did she find this?" I asked, throat tight with unexpected emotion. "Eleanor has kept archives on every family affected by Western acquisitions," Carter admitted. "She's been collecting them for decades. Her own form of reparation preparation, I suppose." The revelation shouldn't have surprised me, yet it did. This evidence that Eleanor had been playing an even longer game than I'd imagined, orchestrating a reckoning that spanned generations. A knock at the door interrupted us. Lucia stood there, no longer in her maid's uniform, but dressed in business attire, a portfolio clutched to her chest. "The first case files are ready for review," she said, her role now formalized as the Restitution Initiative's chief researcher. Who better to document historical injustices than the woman who had spent years organizing the very archives that chronicled them? "We should get started," I nodded, gathering myself. "The press will want specifics beyond today's announcements." As if summoned by my words, my phone buzzed with a notification. A breaking news alert from the Wall Street Journal. Financial markets react to Western restitution program. Analysts divided on long-term impact. Carter glanced at the headline over my shoulder. Having second thoughts? About the initiative? No. I set the phone aside. About whether one family's accountability can really change systemic problems? That's a more complicated question. We're not just one family anymore, he pointed out. Blackwood's interest means others will follow. Self-interest, if nothing else. Speaking of self-interest, Lucia interjected, there's something else you both should see. She opened her portfolio, extracting a document bearing the presidential seal. This arrived at the Foundation office this morning. The White House is establishing a commission on historical financial restitution, and they're requesting your participation, Maria. I stared at the official letter, momentarily speechless. What had begun as a personal confrontation between Maid and Billionaire was evolving into something with potential national implications. They're watching what we're doing here, Carter said quietly, testing whether our model could be scaled, or co-opting it to appear progressive while limiting actual impact, I countered, ever the skeptic. Either way, Lucia observed, you've moved from invisible to influential in less than a year. The three of us stood in thoughtful silence, each contemplating the distance traveled and the road ahead. From the campus grounds outside came the sounds of life returning, students laughing, facilities staff directing furniture deliveries, community members exploring what would soon become a neighborhood hub rather than an exclusive enclave. I need to return to the mansion, Lucia said finally. Eleanor has requested a full briefing on today's events. After she left, Carter moved to the window, watching the activity below. When you first looked me in the eye that night and talked about respect, did you ever imagine it would lead here? Never, I admitted, joining him. I expected to be fired, not to find myself reshaping a corporate empire. And I never expected to be questioned by my maid, much less to find wisdom in her challenge. He turned to me, his expression serious. We've made a good start, Maria. But the real test comes when the publicity fades and the actual work of reconciliation gets harder. I know. I gestured toward the files Lucia had left. These are just the first cases of hundreds, maybe thousands. Many will be complicated, with incomplete records and competing claims. The easy narrative of villainous billionaire and virtuous victims rarely matches reality. Are you suggesting my family might not have been entirely villainous? Carter asked, with a hint of his old sardonic humor. I'm suggesting that human systems are complex, and that acknowledging that complexity doesn't diminish the need for accountability. A text message interrupted us, Elena asking if I'd join the family for dinner to discuss next steps for the health center. The message ended with words that would have been unthinkable months ago. Invite Carter if you want. I showed him the message, watching his reaction carefully. Progress, I observed. Tentative progress, he corrected. As it should be. Trust is earned, not purchased. And there it was, the fundamental lesson that had transformed both our lives over these extraordinary months. Real change wasn't measured in grand gestures or press conferences, but in the slow, steady work of rebuilding what had been broken, of rebalancing accounts long out of equilibrium. We should get back to the office, I said, gathering the files. The real work is just beginning. As we left the campus, students and community members approached us, some with gratitude, others with lingering suspicion, most with stories of how the college's closure had affected their lives. We listened to each one. Carter no longer the aloof billionaire, me no longer the invisible maid. Two people united by an unlikely partnership and a shared commitment to making what was wrong, if not right, then at least acknowledged and addressed. Behind us, the restored building stood as a physical manifestation of what might be possible, not perfect atonement, but a beginning. A visible reminder that even the most entrenched systems of privilege could be questioned, challenged, and eventually transformed, not by grand gestures of charity, but by the harder, humbler work of justice. As we drove back to Manhattan, the Queen's skyline receding behind us, I thought about Eleanor's note. The true measure of wealth is what you give away. Perhaps the wealthiest people weren't those who accumulated the most, but those who found the courage to let go of privilege, of defensiveness, of the comforting myths that insulated them from the consequences of their advantages. By that measure, Carter Weston was becoming a truly wealthy man. And I, in ways that had nothing to do with money, had found an unexpected richness of my own. The road ahead would be difficult, the resistance fierce, the outcomes uncertain. But as the car crossed the bridge connecting Queens to Manhattan, two boroughs separated by more than just water, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before Michael's illness. Hope, not just for myself, but for the possibility of systems once thought immutable being remade into something more just, one balance sheet at a time.